Before we go any further in to where we left off, and if you want to start getting your placement in the book ready, it was chapter 2, and we were going to pick up at verse 12. So following the line that probably read something like, "For God shows no partiality." But I actually wanted to go back a step. David had done some extra research over the last week on a kind of a word study. And I think I created a monster when I brought up I'm just teasing, I created an angel when I brought up the interlinear Greek for the rest of us, that big heavy book from last week. So David did a kind of a deep dive on the word for righteousness that Paul uses. The word in particular was used in chapter 1, verse 17. And then I think again at the end of the sentence too, but this is from the NRSV, verse 17 of chapter 1. "For it is in the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." So David, can I turn it over to you? I'm excited to hear what we got. Oh, you're muted.
David, you're on mute.
Okay. I'm not sure you know what you got in Evangelical. Make any kind of a presentation. Our sermons generally run 30, 35 minutes or longer, so you may have created a monster. No, I'll try to keep it shortish. But anyway, yeah, I come from I went to school, and so I'm kind of a Bible and theology nerd. I'll try to keep from having a nerdgasm here and just keep it kind of brief. So anyway, I have a little sign here. I don't know if you can see it. It's backwards, so it's not going to work. Okay.
Oh, no.
All right, that's not good.
She was right side up for us, so go ahead.
Yeah, it does work.
Okay, good. So then here it is. The top is the word that Paul uses for righteousness. And the top part is what's called a transliteration. What a transliteration is, it takes English letters that sound like what it sounds like in Greek. Okay? And below that is what the word would look like in Greek. That would be actually Greek letters. So that gives you an idea of the word. So when we look at a lot of words that are used in the Bible, it's a little difficult to understand what they mean. For example, righteousness. What does righteousness really mean? It's not a word we use in common conversation anymore. And if we realize that words change, they evolve. And this particular word, righteousness, is an old theological term that they've used for years and years, but it probably doesn't have much meaning to us in common conversation. In fact, if we talk about righteousness, we may be thinking about something that's like moral behavior, acting right, doing the right thing. But doesn't really do justice at all. And justice is kind of a play on words to what dikaiosune means. Anyway, so as Greg said, he pointed us to this interlinear. Okay? An interlinear for the rest of us. I highly recommend that. I really do. I got it. I didn't have it before. It replaces like 3 other sources that I have. You can use this really easily to do word studies. And it's a really good source. You can carry it with you. It takes some muscles because it's kind of heavy, but it does do a good job. And so I looked at the back and I looked up dikaiosune in the interlinear. And this is what it says. Dikaiosune: fair and equitable dealing, justice, integrity, virtue, generosity, alms, piety, godliness, investiture with attribute of righteousness, acceptance as righteous, justification, provision or mean for justification, or instance of justification. That's a lot of information. And as you can see, as you're looking at that, like English words, a Greek word can mean a lot of different things. You think of the English word run. Think of the different ways we use that, can have different meanings in different contexts. And so just looking at a dictionary definition or a lexicon definition of dikaiosune doesn't really tell us what it means in that particular passage. It's kind of important to go and find out what it means when it's used by that author, and then what it means when it's used in that particular passage, if possible. So what I did, as I went to one of my other sources that goes back to my college days, it's called the Dictionary of New Testament Theology. It's by Colin Brown. Big fat book. It's actually 3 volumes. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. And, you know, magicians say you should never let anybody in on a secret. I'm going to let you in on a secret about pastors. And that's, I went to school. I was a religion major, so I studied a lot of theology and a lot of Bible. And when you do that, they don't teach you how to read Greek or Hebrew and translate it on the fly. They don't actually teach you how to do that at all. They teach you how to pronounce. And when they teach you theology, they don't teach you complete theology. What they really do is they teach you how to use sources. So what you can do is they teach you what good sources are. They teach you how you can use them and how you can use these sources to understand yourself and to explain it to other people. That's one thing I really appreciate about Greg when he gives his sermons. He does an excellent job of using contemporary cultural references to explain ancient theological and biblical principles. And so, you know, when you talk about the Academy Awards or the Beatles or something like that, that's putting the hay down where the goats can eat it. And it's in it, you know, I really appreciate that about Greg, how he does that. So in my I found that it's important to realize that good pastors use good sources. Like one of my old pastors used to say, all work and no plagiarism makes Jack a very dull preacher. And it's especially funny. It's especially funny when you realize his name was Jack. But anyway, anyway, so I'm just going to look at a couple things here real quick in the Dictionary of New Testament Theology. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the fact that righteousness, the word that's translated in classical Greek that refers to righteousness from the same family that dikaiosune comes from. Originally in Greek, it referred to one whose behavior fitted into the framework of his society and who fulfilled his righteous obligation towards the gods and his fellow men. So there's very much the concept of ethics and justice there. And so that's very strong. It's not just not doing the wrong things. It's not like don't shoot with girls that do, but it's more than that. It's actively pursuing justice. So this word then developed from the use of dikaio, then into dikaiosune, and it came to mean more of a reference for righteousness between man and man, and at the same time the framework within which a man may share and go on sharing in God's righteousness. Now in the Septuagint, this word dikaios is used to translate the Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word is tzedek or tzedekah or tzaddik. If I'm not pronouncing that right, feel free to correct me, Greg. I have to pronounce Greg or Hebrew using transliteration because I didn't study Greek or
Right,
Hebrew.
Dave,
Yeah, great.
let me just again, just a reminder, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, so the Old Testament, that Jesus's time period they would have had around at their disposal. kind of the official Greek version of their Hebrew scriptures. Yeah. All right, go ahead.
Exactly. Exactly. I was gonna say it refers to 70 because the mythology is that 70 different scholars translated it. They were assigned to do this by one of the pharaohs that were the Ptolemies in Egypt. And the myth is that 70 scholars translated it. They translated in a very brief period of time. They translated it independently, and miraculously, all of the translations into Greek were exactly the same. So that's kind of an interesting mythology that goes along with it. You can take that for what it means.
Sorry to laugh.
The reason, no, I'm laughing too. Obviously, it's kind of funny. And why it's important for Paul, especially, is because the Septuagint was the version of the Hebrew Bible that most people were aware of in the time of Jesus and in the time of Paul. The version of the Hebrew scripture they have now, which is the Masoretic text, is like 900 years after this. It goes much later. It's around the 7th or the 10th century after Christ, whereas this the Septuagint was translated in the 2nd century. Anyway, what the point is, Jesus probably used the Septuagint. Paul certainly used it. So this is the Bible they knew. So then righteousness in the Old Testament, it's not just a matter of actions conforming to a given set of absolute legal standards, but it talks about a behavior which is in keeping with the two-way relationship between God and man. So the righteousness of God appears in God-like dealings with his people. And for the Old Testament and for Paul, these dealings are not based on the negative and judgment. They're based on mercy and grace and the covenant and things like that. So this is important too, because Paul, when we get to Paul, we find out that Paul used the Old Testament understanding of justice more than any other writer in the New Testament. This was a very important concept for Paul. We'll hear about righteousness more throughout Romans, especially in chapter 6. But for Paul, God's righteousness is essentially his covenant dealings with his people, who thereby are constituted a new humanity, a new Israel comprising both Jews and Gentiles. For Paul, God's righteousness was this relationship that God had with people, and because of that, the people can have with one another. A relationship that, yes, is based on ethics, but it's based on more. It's based on true justice, fairness, equity for everyone. Now, for Paul, this is a special, the righteousness is not achieved by what we can do. He points out how the Jews tried to be righteous according to the law. But according to Paul, the law only proved that they couldn't be righteous on their own. It was just a way of showing that we couldn't meet the standard for God's righteousness. And so for Paul, we can only be justified, which is another use of the word. It's the same word, dikaiosune. It's the act that God does through faith in what Jesus did. God gives us the gift of grace. God gives us this justification. It's the only way we can truly be just, is because God gives this to us because he wants us. It's nothing we can do on our own efforts. It doesn't come through the law. It doesn't come through anything we do. But this is a gift. Our only part in this is this: we accept God's gift by faith. So it's a gracious gift through our faith. And because of the gift that God gives us, it allows us to live a life of graciousness, a life of righteousness. And this life we live is enabled by the justification, by the righteousness of God. And it's lived out in recognition that because God has done this for us, then we ought to give our bodies and our lives to him. And so that just gives you a brief rundown of kind of how Paul uses righteousness. And I think as we read on and we see how Paul uses this in additional chapters, it'll give us an idea of what Paul's talking about when he uses the term righteousness.
Wow.
Okay, Greg, thanks very much.
Great. What I love too is that, and I'm curious what other people think, but it's just the English word righteous just has kind of a strange kind of smell to it, if that makes any other sense. That could be just because the kind of more fundamentalist side that uses it in a way that they kind of think they know what they're saying, but they don't often do this deep dive that you've just done, that it really does connect to a long tradition of understanding and parsing out how God, kind of what God expects for us, if God expects anything, and then it really is just about whether we accept it or do we kind of turn away from it. And I think the thing that what you were saying got me thinking is, the difference again between trying to do good things in a transactional way. In other words, if I do something good, I'll get into heaven. It's probably, a childlike way to say it, but honestly, adults think that way too. If I do good thing here, I give the homeless person money, I get the Easter egg basket for Grace Church or linens for Lent. I therefore have purchased my ticket to get into heaven. And Paul is basically saying that is not how it works. You should do good things because you want to do good things. Do you think that's a fair way to say it, David? Or you should be a good person
we do things.
because that's what you're called to be. Yeah.
We do good things because God loved us,
right?
Because we love God in return, and God has enabled us to love others rightly and express our love for God as love for others as well.
Exactly. What do others think? Or what did you hear or respond to? Going to go out and use righteousness in a sentence?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just going to say I liked righteousness as integrity. Integrity is doing the right thing even when nobody's watching. Yeah. So I think that when I think of righteous, integrity comes in there real strong.
That's a great way to say it.
I just really like the idea of righteousness as being in relationship with God, that it isn't necessarily like one quality, but the act of negotiating a relationship with God. And if you're trying to negotiate a relationship with someone who is all good, it's hard to be in that relationship in good faith without also trying to be as good as we can be. So it's not necessarily I have to be a certain way. It's I have to engage in this relationship. And, we come up short a lot, but that doesn't mean we're not still in relationship. So I thought that was really beautiful and useful. So thank you, David.
Anybody else? Awesome. Well, like David,
Susan's talking, but
I think she's talking to somebody in the room.
All I'll say is that I do not do all of that. David does it, and I'll read a word and I'll have to sit. I just go and ask him, and he'll start that, and then he tells me because I don't have the patience to do all that studying, and that's fine.
I'm in awe of David's knowledge. I feel like that, unfortunately, in my Roman Catholic education, the history and the meaning of specific words and stuff was not stressed in my education. And I hunger for that now. I want to know more about it because it makes a big difference when you read the Bible, when you know what was going on politically and historically, and why the words they chose, what they meant at the time.
Yep,
It makes a big difference in just reading it right now today for,
exactly. Now, I haven't read it yet, but I showed last time, you can see this red book probably in the distance on screen, but the one volume for Romans that's in the Anchor Yale Bible. This is the kind of thing, when you're near a seminary, which we actually are. We're near several seminaries in Chicago, but Episcopal Seminary in Virginia, which I both lived on and lived near, you could just go in and just use these sources. So we, like David said about sources, one of the reasons you want something like this is because they make it almost like an encyclopedia. And I'm seeing in here the word diakosine, and they basically spend about 3 pages of dense text doing a lot of what David just did, but also trying to reference that word when Paul uses it elsewhere. And this is kind of neat because I'm just literally glancing through the text because I haven't read it. 2 Corinthians 5:21, Philippians 3:9. So in other words, they cross-referenced all the letters in the New Testament and said, well, where else does Paul talk about righteousness? Turns out it does it a lot, as David was hinting at. And also it's the same word or derivation of the word. So we know then that it's what Paul's talking about. And this is, by the way, kind of part of the process of what they do to authenticate a letter as whether it was Paul writing or not. See what I mean? So if somebody is using a different word entirely for righteousness, then, or another translation word, then that calls into question whether or not that was Paul or not. Does that make sense, everybody? Yeah.
Yep.
Amongst other factors and criteria and all. Yeah. So
Writing style.
right, exactly. Right. Okay, you would, those
Speaking
that
of
have
which-
read. Hey, David.
No, I was just going to say real quick, I raised an issue last week about the prison epistles, and that comes into that I looked up that the prison epistles are 4 epistles that were written by Paul from prison, but the reason they aren't, two of them are Colossians and Ephesians, and they're certainly probably later than Romans, but because of vocabulary and various other things, those things are not thought to be genuinely from Paul. They might be from Paul's school later on, but they just don't use the same kind of vocabulary and things like that. So that's why the prison epistles are not. And then there's Galatians and Philemon, but they were probably written earlier. But that just kind of applies to this, that a lot of the things in the New Testament that were traditionally assigned to Paul, modern scholars don't think they probably are, because just the whole structure and the way the vocabulary used and the way they use the vocabulary doesn't seem to be much like how Paul wrote in other letters. And it's hard to believe he just assumed a completely new personality to write another letter. So yeah. Anyway.
And adding to the confusion is they begin with him saying, I am Paul, or subversion like that. So people took it for granted and saying, well, then Paul wrote it. But actually, I've talked about this before, that in the first century, to write someone's name was considered a great honor, not plagiarism outright. It meant I am writing as if Paul has given me the keys to the car to do the theological writing, And those 2 letters, Colossians and Ephesians, wonderful letters, incredibly important to the canon, it's definitely, if you had to rank them of which ones are Paul or Paul not, those 2 are on the cusp. I mean, I think most scholars, especially those that read the Bible more liberally, are skeptical, but it's hazy. It's tricky. They don't know. No one knows certainly for sure. Anyway, thank you for doing the follow-up on the prison epistles, because I forgot to do that. All right. Well, why don't we continue on? Chapter 2. Verse 12, and I'm going to start with I'm just going to finish this paragraph here at least. This is from the New Revised Standard Version. All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. When Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel, God, through Jesus Christ, will judge the secret thoughts of all. So those now curious and you're getting a little more educated in how to do a deep dive on translation and text and stuff. Don't you want to go digging like David did on secret thoughts? What's that all about? But I think it was just similar to what maybe Dawn was saying about, you know, we do good things because we want to be good people and do things where we know people are not watching. You said it better than I did.
Integrity, yeah.
Yeah, the integrity. I think that's what that gets to.
My Bible that I'm looking at right
Yeah.
now, which is a Catholic version,
Good.
doesn't say secret thoughts, it says hidden works.
Hidden works. Wow. So thoughts and works,
Hidden
that
works.
is a gulf
Hidden-
in English, you know what I
Hidden
mean?
works through Jesus Christ, it says.
Yeah.
I have the New American Bible and mine says says it different.
CB says hidden truth about human beings through Christ.
All right, well, this is worth,
Secrets of
I'm gonna
men.
do a quick look and see
Well,
what
this
that
is-
word is in Greek,
Maybe this
unless
is
David
the
beats me to it.
revised, it's the revised.
Mm.
Yeah, clearly scholars over time
691.
have disagreed on the English word there. That's interesting. So if you were in seminary, which you certainly can go at any age for any reason, you don't have to do it to become a priest. You can just do it to just educate yourself. You could go and you could end up writing exegesis or exegesis. Yes, David.
Yeah, the Greek word is kryptos. I have a program I have on my computer, and it has all the strong numbers, so I can just look it up. I can bring up parallel translations, and the word there is man, and for the man part, and then it's kryptos is the Greek word, and it means hidden, concealed, private. I think it's from where we get the English word, cryptography, for code and stuff like
Cryptic.
that. So it talks about hidden, inward, or secret, concealed thoughts of man, the hidden conceal. Actually, I'm trying to see, but
I'm trying to look too. What's the word it's modifying, the noun?
it doesn't say, it's man, secrets of man. It doesn't
Oh, wow.
literally say thoughts. It says secrets of man. There is
Again,
no,
yeah, some of you might be glazing over. I hope not, because I think this is like we're digging an archaeological dig.
Mhm.
And we're going, in Greek, it was meant to be something a little bit, I mean, this is what Hebrew does to the nth degree. It's leaving a lot for interpretation intentionally. And and English speakers of the 21st century, we want to tell me exactly what it is in black and white, right? And the text is actually trying to give you some room to understand. So secrets of man would be an interesting, and of course we mean humankind there. We don't mean just men, but secrets of man could be all kinds of things. But you see how each of these Bibles have chosen to try to pinpoint what they think that means. Isn't that interesting? Which is why
so
there's so
it's
many.
not absolute.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's not absolutely clear here if it's thoughts or actions or what. That's up for some interpretation there. So that's kind of interesting.
That's a fun little excursion.
I was just looking it up in the Message. They gloss over the problem that we're encountering entirely and just say that the message from God that I proclaim through Jesus Christ takes into account all these differences.
Interesting.
So
And
they
you see-
totally gloss over the problematic translation there.
This just says men's secrets.
Yeah, that's also, by the way,
That-
Brendan,
And what,
where they get the name of the book from, The Message, because in
Mhm.
his translation of good news is the message. Yeah.
and I think this points out something that we are kind of beating around the bush on, but I'll just say right out, and that is every translation is an interpretation.
Exactly.
You know, there is no such thing as a word for word translate. Well, there could be, but it wouldn't make much sense to us. But every translation, they're trying to express what they think the passage is saying. But every one of them is doing it through their own lens, their own history, their own experiences, their own theology. And so when you compare a lot of translations, you get a lot of different flavors and realize that sometimes it's difficult to arrive at a specific meaning about what the original author's intent was, because we're not that guy. We're not there at that time. We don't know what he's addressing. So it's all, even when it seems like, someone's just interpreting or translating, it's actually an interpretation.
I think if you're studying any kind of language, there's the concrete words like yellow and 10 that you can have an exact word for
Right.
word interpretation, but any of these other words that are more left up to your imagination. When I was a kid, my dad used to say, when you study another language, you have to learn how to think in that language.
Yeah.
You don't want to translate it. You need to think in that. So these words probably did have a lot of different meanings than we can actually translate into our language.
Right.
Well, and wasn't the rabbinic tradition at the time that they would just tussle over the meanings of scripture?
Still is.
Just really lively stuff, not word for word, this is true.
Right.
Word for word, what does this mean?
Right.
More like that.
Right?
David.
Yep.
The other one that reminds me of that, I can't harp on it enough, and that came up in a sermon maybe 2-3 weeks ago, is when they reference God in the Bible, and I do mean they, the many writers of all the many books, when they reference God in the Bible, what we're looking at in English on the page has a significance, whether in its original Hebrew or Greek. And, the Lord could mean a title like king or something.
Mhm.
But when it's Lord with the little O-R-D capitalized, that's a placeholder for Yahweh, the name of God. And those, when they chose to use which word means a whole great deal theologically of what they're doing. And it gets to what David's saying about that means what you choose to find it in English is an interpretation.
Mhm.
Yeah. So let's keep going. Would someone like to read one of these different Greg's going to read. Great. Starting on page, verse 17,
Okay.
the Jews and the law. And I think you can go to the end of the chapter here. This is all one thought.
Okay. Let us suppose you bear the name of Jew and rely firmly on the law and pride yourself on God. Instructed by the law, you know his will and are able to make sound judgments on disputed points. You feel certain that you can guide the blind and enlighten those in darkness, that you can discipline the foolish and teach the simple, because in the law you have at hand a clear pattern of knowledge and truth. Now then, teacher of others, are you failing to teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob the temples? You who pride yourself on the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As scripture says, on your account, the name of God is held in contempt among the Gentiles. Circumcision, to be sure, has value if you observe the law, but if you break it, you might as well be uncircumcised. Again, if an uncircumcised person keeps the precepts of the law, will he not be considered circumcised? If a man who is uncircumcised keeps the law, he will pass judgment on you who, with your written law and circumcision, break it. Appearance does not make a Jew. True circumcision is not a sign in the flesh. He is a real Jew who is one inwardly, and true circumcision is of the heart. Its source in the spirit, not the letter. Such a one receives his praise, not from men, but from God.
And again, that's the New American Bible, right?
Which
Which is
Roman Catholic
kind of a Roman Catholic. So fascinating.
It's different.
Isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
Well, for those that blush like I do when circumcision comes up, we're not talking about the act so much. We're talking about what it symbolizes, which is somebody's piety, you know, whether they are a Jew or raised a Jew or whether or not, basically. And so he's using that as a kind of a tool to get at the heart of the matter, which really is probably what he's trying to say here in verse 28, which is kind of extraordinary, and 29, that real circumcision is a matter of the heart, is what my text says.
Mhm. Mhm.
What do you all think?
I always wondered what if you needed people to be, why would God give you a body part that he then tells you to take it off, remove it?
Yeah, well, why do we pierce our ears? You
Well,
know,
God doesn't tell us that's, I mean. just
well,
'cause
I don't know. Catholics, don't you pierce babies' ears when they're little girls?
That's
That's kind of a,
Europeans,
Yeah,
maybe.
that was a tradition
Yeah.
when I was a little
European.
kid, yeah.
I mean, there's a religious thing about, for lack of a better word, body mutilation as a kind of a showing of subservience and part of a community. I think we talked about this before with Genesis, probably, that if I've got my theology right, where it's sometimes it's a retrofit to explain why the tradition is already happening. And the tradition of removing young boys' foreskin was probably already in place by the time they started to come up with a society of not society, but a religious ceremony around it. And so the things kind of get retrofitted into it a little bit. But I'm not an expert on the history of Jewish circumcision. But I know that it's, in modern times, it's got a kind of a health cleanliness effect. So maybe that's what it began with originally. I don't know.
It is interesting, though, that particular practice was chosen as a symbol of being a child of God or a member of the
Right.
chosen people,
Right.
which kind of leaves women out.
Yeah.
I mean, if it had been a more inclusive culture, they would have chosen something that would be equally applied to men and women,
Right.
not something that's just done to males.
Right.
And they have a whole ceremony.
And in fact, the biological thing that happens to women naturally became a source of excusing them basically from leadership and authority, and basically defining them as impure,
Mhm.
because what's happening to your body is just happening, whereas what happens to men is done to them, kind of like a ritual,
But
like
it's
more like a
intentional also,
caveman kind of
right.
ritual of
Yes.
just,
Mhm.
like blood brothers, it's the same
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's a good point, Greg. It just shows how deeply patriarchal.
Very. Yeah.
I mean, we saw
They
it.
are, yeah.
Here I am. I'm going to use a source, everyone. The source we can't stop talking about this week, unfortunately. But what happened Sunday night at the Academy Awards is an evolutionary caveman thing, which is men will react violently, for especially if they're under the influence, which I think may have been part of the problem. Or feel like their family or whatever is protected. And I'm not condoning it or explaining it off. I'm just saying that's what happened.
Mhm.
And it was wrong, and it was on display for the whole world, and probably has set back raising of young men a few years at least in how to behave when you're threatened. And so I'm saying that, patriarchy, it just keeps popping up. It just will not go away. And we see it on display sometimes.
Deeply embedded in our culture.
Deeply
even still.
embedded. Yeah. And I think you heard it in his trying to explain it away. And now he's got handlers around him trying to
Mhm.
walk it back, who are probably women.
Me that he was more incensed by the fact that his wife was than she was, and she's kind of obsessed.
Well,
with
she
it.
did what you
I mean,
should
she
do,
just
which is
did
she
her
rolled her
eye
eyes of
rolls,
like,
like,
give me
okay,
an
whatever.
effing break here, right? Thank you, in front of live television,
Right.
both of them, right?
Yeah. Well-
Sorry, I just wanted to use a topical example. Patriarchy on display for the world.
But that one little phrase there, he is a real Jew who is one inwardly.
Yeah.
I mean, that says a lot,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
Again, any kind of, showy
Right.
attempts to be pious and all that kind of thing, or doing good works
Paul
for the
wanted
sake.
none of that.
Right.
Right.
Well, isn't
Exactly.
he also?
You don't need that to be a follower of God.
Isn't he also kind of trying to defend his position that the Gentiles don't have to get circumcised to adopt the Christian faith?
Right. And
Because that's what a lot of the Jews were saying, well, they're not circumcised, so.
no, the act of circumcision was covenantal. It was a sign of the relationship between God, according to their scriptures, which were written by men, as a way to illustrate the covenant between God and them, right? Paul is saying that's not covenant, that you don't need to do that to be covenant. You don't need to be, it's all part of a piece for him that God, when Paul also says elsewhere in this letter, Jew and Greek alike, or Jew and Gentile alike, that makes that whole practice obsolete. Unless you just want to do it for the heck of it.
Did that include all of the other things, like all of the purity laws and all of the other rituals that it meant to be Jewish? All of those were just erased basically if Jew and Gentile.
I can't say for sure, to be honest.
I would think that there might be some sanitary reasons for doing some of those rituals. Think of where they lived, they didn't have refrigeration. You had to make sure animals were butchered properly so that you didn't wind up ill. Same with the circumcision, it might be a matter of cleanliness.
Sure, absolutely. And health.
Well, as I had mentioned one time along, several sessions ago, being a nurse, there is some evidence that women that are married to uncircumcised men have a higher incidence of cervical cancer due to, I don't know if their husbands are not as clean or if it's friction or what, but yeah, so
It's just a fact.
it's
right?
just a fact, yeah.
There's just parts of our bodies that just bacteria live and grow.
Right.
That's just part of it, And so again, I kind of like to question the wannabe anthropologist in me always wants to go, I bet this practice was happening first before they were articulate enough to really have a religion down and pat. And then things kind of get retrofitted to let's make this a sign of our relationship to God, probably came second. And I'm not saying
Right,
that's
but it
valid.
still makes you wonder, where the heck did that come from?
Yeah, but it's just such a very specific thing. And, it's probably it could be, I'm just guessing, again, somebody who's anthropologist or archaeologist may know better, or Jew. I'm just throwing some straws out there. I wonder if it's because it's the most sensitive part of a male, that this was a sign of bravery or courage, or especially if you're doing it to an adult, this was a sign of, the ultimate man. I'm trying to think of the most patriarchal thing.
Yeah,
Most manly thing you can do is undergo that and live to tell the story.
I read a book
to
one
do
time.
it for your God.
Yeah, exactly. Like walking across hot coals,
This book that I read was by a guy named Malachi Martin, who actually had quite a high position in the Vatican for a long time. And he wrote a history of the papacy and this and that. But he also wrote this book called King David.
Oh, yeah.
And in this historical fiction, David falls in love with a Philistine man, the king, I think, of them, some kind of a way.
Wow.
And
Kind of like
has surgically a foreskin reattached.
Huh.
Because this was a barrier between he and this
Wow.
non-Jew. So, I mean, again, it's obviously fictional.
Yep.
But it's an interesting thing that part of the identity that labeled him a Jew,
Right.
he wanted to be rid of so that he would be accepted by this other culture equally.
Right.
Just kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Interesting.
That's not entirely fictional, Greg. In the time of Jesus, Jews weren't able to go to the Greek gymnasium, which is where guys gathered to exercise and whatever, take baths and things like that, because they were circumcised. And there was a surgical procedure that uncircumcised Jews, that some of the Hellenistic Jews performed so that they could go to the gymnasium and be part of the patriarchal Hellenistic culture. So that's not just strictly fiction. I think what you said about circumcision and what you said about, you know, the signs and who is a true Jew gets back to the fact that Paul's trying to point out that from the beginning, the Jews weren't special to God because of these signs, but these were signs that they performed to show that they belong to God, and that they belong to God not just selfishly for themselves to reap benefits, but they belong to God in order to be a light to the nations. And so that someone who is performing this and doing these kind of acts and actually acting with the kind of justice and compassion that God wants is more of a true Jew, a true person of God, than someone who is just engaging in the ritual activities.
Yeah, and this is an act far more significant than, say, if you just tattoo your forehead or something. You know what I mean? This is something that shows the lengths you're willing to go, right? Ooh, okay. Let's get out of this and go on to chapter 3. And would someone like to read verses 1 to 8? And we'll probably stop there for the day from their Bibles. Maybe somebody on screen. Oh, thanks, Susan. What Bible are you reading?
I have the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which is the New Revised Standard Version.
Terrific. Thank you. All right. Verse 1 to 8 would be great.
Then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way, for in the first place, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Will their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Although everyone is a liar, let God be proved true, as it is written, so that you may be justified in your words and prevail in your judging. There's a little note here that says, in the Greek, when you are being judged was also in there. In your judging, that it was when you are judged.
Got it.
But if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? That God is unjust to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my falsehood, God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not say, as some people slander us by saying that we say, let us do evil so that good may come. Their condemnation is deserved. What then? Are we any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin, as it is written.
Right.
There is no one.
Oh, sorry. We'll stop there, Susan.
Okay.
I think that's right. Yes, exactly. There's some disagreement about when that section ends. I'm looking at one of my sources. I think, well, tell me what jumps out to you.
I find it really interesting, this section here, because it's basically explicitly saying that doing evil is not a means of gaining good or gaining grace. And I'm reminded of the often cherry-picked verses that we have in other pieces of the Bible, but somehow the people that are advocating for revelation to be happening now in Israel conveniently leave this part out.
You're right.
I just like the way he talks in here because he's making conversation with himself.
Yes.
He asks the question and then he answers the question.
Yes.
We're not allowed to do, we're told not to do that.
Showing off a little bit. That's how great a writer he is, a speaker he is. That's a rhetorical flair. Yeah. I mean, it's not unlike something Martin Luther King would have done, you know. And I love how many parentheticals are in here, as if he's having a little aside to a third party, you know, narrator or something. Isn't that interesting? You really get, this is another example of, this is so authentically Paul's writing that you can compare other sources to this to help, like some of the letters that are in dispute, to say, doesn't sound like Paul. This sounds like Paul, and it holds up in English. That's how powerful his writing is. Yeah.
It reminds me of when I was a kid, the old Roman Catholic saying, or the belief that you had to be a Catholic to get into heaven.
Yeah.
When he's saying just because you're a Jew doesn't mean that,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
guaranteed to have, God's grace,
Yeah.
and so, it's like,
Actions speak louder than words.
exactly,
Sure.
exactly,
Actions speak louder than words.
exactly.
Did anyone bristle in verse 4 when he said everyone is a liar? I think that's kind of every translation says that, right?
Well, it's just the same as Jesus saying, "You who are without sin,
Yeah.
cast the first stone."
He's actually, one of my footnotes says he's quoting a Psalm, Psalm 16, 11, and Psalm 51, 4.
Right.
51 is what we do at Ash Wednesday. If you came to an Ash Wednesday service or viewed it online, especially the one in the evening, Psalm 51 will always be etched in my heart because I had a piece of music ready to go and I forgot to cue it up before the service began. We got right to that point in the service and I was like, well, SHIT. We'll just say Psalm 51, and we had to open our prayer books and do it. And I think it probably says in there, because it's so much talking about sin. All we are but liars, or all we, don't speak truths.
Which I find is very true, even to the point of we lie to ourselves
Right.
about who
We
we
lie to
are.
ourselves. Exactly. But you see verse 6 again, by no means, for this is NRSV, this is what Susan read. For then how could God judge the world? He's not asking for an answer. That's rhetorical. That's where we get the origin of rhetorical questions. How could God judge the world is a rhetorical question. This is Greek writing at its finest of its day.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, anyone? I'm just picking out a few other things in here. Oracles is kind of a peculiar word. When I did a Greek pilgrimage about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, we went. It was Greece through Paul's eyes, and we did Delphi. Has anyone heard of Delphi before?
Yeah.
Yep.
Delphi has a famous oracle. It's a stone piece of rock with a hole carved out into it, or water ran through it. And you would go and you would kind of peek in and you would ask a question to the oracle and supposedly
Well, the
hear something
priestess-
back,
There was actually a priestess, and I've seen things on TV where they say that hole is actually over like a volcanic
Yeah.
chimney, and that there's gases, sulfuric gases that come up out of that hole that would cause these priestesses to kind of go into a chemical trance. Yeah,
wow.
and then they'd have these dreams, and
Amazing.
And the priest could interpret them any way he wanted.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's just it's a neat little example of just how again, using that word Hellenistic, Paul is. I mean, how much time he's spent in Greece already at the writing of this letter, and probably has been to Delphi many times because it's just part of the lore of it's like going to Six Flags or something. You just go and I rode the
Temple
Batman
of
roll.
Apollo.
Right, yeah, the Temple of Apollo, exactly.
Well, my Bible says utterances instead of oracles.
Instead of oracles, yeah, exactly. All right, well, thank you, everyone. This was a lot of fun. David, thank you for that.
Thank you, David.
Your research project, your homework.
Thank you.
Well, you get an A.
David, you're a wonder.
That's true.